Welcome to the briefing. As you can see, we've got quite a packed agenda, in fact, today. In fact, it could have been even more packed had we actually had a social care white paper. But instead, what we've got is a piece on social care funding, a little bit on the national living wage, a quick roundup of some of the stuff in the state of care report for 2021. And then Julian's going to talk about some of the kind of inspection outcomes, a bit of an update on that. We're going to look at some of the DoLS and safeguarding data that's come out. And then finally, Jane is going to finish by taking us through a bit more detail now about where we are with the NHS reforms. But I wanted to start with funding and really to talk about what that means in terms of how things have moved forward. So where to start? It's just 22 months later than promised. We now know something about the government's plans for fixing social care. It has to be said they didn't get universal support, particularly from some of their own papers, or the papers that normally back them. I'm quite torn between my own personal favourite of Bojo's Biggest Gamble, or You Don't Break a Manifesto Pledge for Ages, then two come along at the same time. You'll remember this was also the point at which they announced the end to the triple lock on pensions, or the temporary suspension, I should say, of the triple lock on pensions. It's also probably true to say that most of the scrutiny at that point was focused on the mechanism for funding rather than what was actually on offer in terms of the fix for social care. But what we wanted to do was to try and take a couple of steps back and to look at this in the context of social care funding more generally, and also obviously in terms of what happened in the budget. So we're going to look at three different kind of points back over the last 12 months. We're going to start with the spending review back in November of 2020. We're going to have a little look at the health and social care levy that came out in September, and then the budget obviously that came out in October. And we'll try and pull it all together to see what that actually means for local authorities, and as a consequence, what it probably means for some of you. I wasn't going to spend very long on this. The spending review's long gone now. The main point about the spending review was it confirmed the £1 billion uplift that had occurred just earlier than that as being a permanent increase to funding. But it also put on the table this idea of local councils being able to raise substantially more money through the social care precept. So local authorities had an increase in their spending power if they chose to tax local people of about 5%. And as you can see, around about 60% of them chose this option. It is true to say there was some political differences in terms of the way people went, but actually about 6% of authorities decided to increase their tax by their local council tax by 5%, which means that they were charging the full 3% for the social care precept. And indeed, that pattern of shifting funding responsibility onto local government was a continuation of what had gone before. There'd been constant attempts to increase the amount of money that was being raised through the precept. Then, of course, in September, we had the big announcement of the health and social care levy, which was the plan to fix social care, which in fact turned out actually to be a plan to fix the backlog of waiting lists within the National Health Service, or at least in the first instance. That was very much the focus of what was on offer. What that really did was several things. First of all, it talked about how they raised the money, and that was an increase of 1.25% on both employees and employers' national insurance contribution, and also on a thing called the dividend tax, I'm sure we're all very familiar with, but essentially it's a means by which people can extract money from their own companies without paying a higher rate of tax, but they've chopped that bit off, so that's a loophole that they've closed. This generates about 13.8 billion, although some people think it might actually generate slightly more than that. About 1.8 billion has to go straight back into the public sector employers to pay for their 1.25% increase in their costs associated with employment of staff. So obviously, no point in doing this if you didn't then give extra money to the National Health Service, for example, to pay its contribution for national insurance. That gives about £12 billion of additional funding. Some of that will go via the devolved administrations of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. In terms of actually fixing social care, that turned out to mean things that were slightly different than perhaps people had originally expected. It does introduce a care cap, £86,000, quite a lot higher than the original time, the first time they introduced a care cap, and that doesn't arrive until October 2023, so 18 months away from the start of the new financial year. Increased the upper capital limit from 22,000 to 100,000. Again, obviously that's something for later on. And similarly, it rose the floor, which had been 14,250 up to £20,000. What that really means is if you've got money, if you've got assets between 20 and 100,000 pounds, the local authority will contribute some money towards the costs of your care, but you will have to contribute up to 20% of your chargeable assets. And as we'll see later on, in terms of how this kind of works for individuals, there's another kind of spin on this, which is also a fact that any kind of movement towards a care cap is only based on your own contributions as opposed to any contributions made by the local authority. And lastly, it increases the amount of money that people are allowed to retain for themselves personally, and that's going to go up by the rate of inflation. So in terms of the levy, it's important to remember this is a 3-year plan that we're talking about here. So we only really know what's going to happen for the next 3 years. We don't know anything about what happens after that. Of the kind of 30.3 billion for over 3 years for health and social care in England, 24.9 billion, or 82% of it, actually goes to the NHS. And that's already a done deal. That's what's going to happen. And that leaves this 5.4 billion, which is the figure that you'll hear a lot of people talk about. CQC talk about it a lot in their State of Care report. Of that 4.5 billion, 500 million is already earmarked for professional development of the workforce. And that presumably is going to relate largely to training and qualifications and the infrastructure needed to support that. And nobody thinks that's a bad thing, but what it does, of course, is a take away from that 5.4 million for social care. So that leaves you about 4.9 billion. And of that 4 million, about 3.6 is going to be needed to pay for the changes to the means testing and for the care cap. I mean, most of that money in reality will go around the kind of changes to means testing, because very few people will be anywhere near their care cap at the point at 3 years on from this. And also because this only actually occurs about halfway through that 3-year timescale, I think you could probably say most of that money is going to go on paying for the means testing. What that means in terms of additionality is there isn't any. It just means there's money to pay for things in a slightly different sort of way than there was before, and means that individuals aren't making the level of contribution they were before. Also, the way that the funding is going to be handed over is backloaded. So because obviously, as from October 23, the numbers of people who qualify are going to grow exponentially through the next 18 months to the end of this 3-year plan. The money therefore has to rise in line with that. So the initial money that local authorities get won't be spent on this, because obviously there isn't going to be anybody qualifying for it, but they won't get a kind of a share of that money in that same way. And this leaves around 1.3 billion over the course of those 3 years, which we think may actually be earmarked for the kind of work that's going to come out of the white paper, but it may not be. It may actually be additional money that they've got to spend on whatever they need to spend it on. That brings us up to the budget for 2021, and a bit of kind of give and take really in this budget. Limited the social care precept to just 1% of council tax. That's down from 3% in the spending review a year earlier. Probably concerned that it might look a bit like kind of double charging. So people would also have a 1% levy and a 3% uplift in their council tax, seen as being a bit too much. Provided about 1.6 billion per year for local government over the next 3 years. Of that 4.8, the total of those 1.6 is all done together. Obviously, some of that will be spent on adult social care, but it will also need to pay for children's services. And as probably most of you know, children's services financially are in some ways in worse state than adult services, and also all other council services. So although it's a big chunk of money, it actually has to go on quite a lot of different sorts of things. And one of the obviously the big ticket items, which we're going to come to a little bit later on, are costs associated with the national living wage, which has gone up by 6.6%. So trying to summarize all this, what does it mean? Over the next 3 years, local authorities will be able to increase council tax by around 2%, we think, a year without a referendum. Similarly, they'll be able to increase their social services precept by about 1% a year without a referendum. They're going to receive an additional 1.6 billion to pay for all local services, including adult social care and other things. And they're going to receive a portion of the 5.4 billion, especially for adult social care, funded out of the new levy. Of that 5.4, as we said, 3.6 will pay for the other costs, 500 million will pay for professional development of the workforce, and that leaves about 1.3 billion over the next 3 years sort of unallocated. We thought it might be useful to do a bit of a ready reckoner. So if you think about an average local authority spends about 40% of their money on adult social care. So you can assume of that 1.6 billion in the budget, about 40% of that will probably go on adult social care, which is about 640 million a year. Of the 5.4, we've been through this already, but basically you've got 1.3, which isn't currently allocated, which works out at about 433 million. What that means is that probably local authorities have gained about an extra £1 billion a year, assuming that 1.3 billion isn't spoken for something else. So what does that look like? £1 billion, if it's just spread by population, which is the main driver for allocation of funds, about half of social service authorities would have less than 5 million. We can see some examples there. So at the top end, people like Kent, which is a big authority, lots of people live there. Then looking at something like 28 million. Then you come to somewhere like Cumbria, which is about 8 million. And then places like Southend and South Tyneside with sort of 3.2 million and 2.6 million. If the 1.3 billion, which is the bit left over from the social care reform, actually has to be spent on something else, and in fact, you're just left with the 640 million. That's just a share of the additional funding they got in the budget. Obviously, that means that nearly 80% of local authorities are going to be looking at less than £5 million of kind of additional money to spend on social care, which isn't taken up by the reforms that have already been announced. So that would mean that places like Southend, just over 2 million, somewhere like South Tyneside, 1.7 million. So some authorities really have quite modest amounts of money to spend on services. So some thoughts on all of this. Firstly, of course, because national insurance levy, that means that it's basically people working who are going to pay for people who are retired, because once you're older, most people don't pay national insurance. And even when it becomes the health and social care levy, so there's a new tax, a new hypothecated tax, it will only apply to state pensioners who are still working. So if you're retired and sitting on millions, actually you don't pay anything additional as a result of this change. And because of the way national insurance works, any earnings above £50,000 attract a rate of only 2%. So the higher your salary goes above this level, the smaller portion of the money that you pay. And we can see it there kind of neatly illustrated that somebody on £20,000 proportionally is paying roughly the same amount as someone on £100,000. So it isn't an income tax that simply rises with income. It's actually capped off at the top. And of course, most care staff are not earning above £50,000, so they won't benefit from that. The benefits themselves have two elements, the more generous means testing and the cap on the costs of care. Obviously, there's very limited details at this stage, and helpfully published last night, the details that we do have. So this is something we don't normally do, which is kind of hot off the press, but we haven't got any choice. So what is it all about? So what it really means is from October of 23, anyone assessed by the local authority as having eligible care and support needs starts their journey towards their care cap. It's very important to recognise that you have to have got that assessment by the local authority. And as we move on, you can see that assessment can have quite an impact on the speed at which you travel towards your cap. 86,000 care cap applies to all care costs. So it's not just about residential nursing care, it's about all the care costs that you might incur, but obviously your domiciliary care journey would be a much longer one towards £86,000 than if you're in a residential or a nursing home. The other thing, coming back to that point about assessment, if, for example, you think you needed to have 5 hours a day of domiciliary care, but you were assessed by the local council as only requiring 2 hours of domiciliary care a day, it's only the 2 hours that you're paying for that are going towards your care cap, because what the local authority says, those other ones are your choice. There's additional hours are your choice. We haven't assessed you as requiring that. So from October, everyone will have a care account. October 23rd, we're going to have a care account, which is where the contributions that you're making towards the cost of your care will be recorded, and that's going to be administered by local authorities. You'll either receive a personal budget, which is when the local authority is paying for it, or independent personal budget, which is when you're paying for it. And the thing to bear in mind is it is about what the local council will have paid for your care which is the bit that determines the speed at which you move towards your care cap. So even if you're paying £1,000 a week, if the local council think that the rate of movement is £400 a week, that's the only bit that counts in terms of your contribution towards building your care cap, which is one of the reasons why people are starting to say maybe this isn't quite everything it was originally cracked up to be. So it's only the money directly contributed towards the care that the person pays themselves. Nothing else contributes towards the care cap. And therefore, what that means is that that group of people who have assets between 20,000 and 100,000 could end up making quite substantial, paying quite substantial amounts of money, and proportionally a much greater amount of their asset than someone who was actually had a much more valuable asset. They're also going to change the law to allow top-ups, and that would include people who are funded by local authorities. They can also top these things up. And there's also going to be a cap on daily living costs of £200 a week. But again, I suspect that people are going to be allowed to top that up. In fact, they are going to be allowed to top that up if they wanted to pay more. Interesting, one of the examples that the government make quite a song and dance about in their papers about explaining how this new system works and the wonderful benefits it has a chap, I think it's called Yusuf, who in their system lives for 8 years once he enters the care home, and therefore does jolly well out of the new system. Most people will take at least 3 years, if not longer, to reach their care cap, and longer still if you're in domiciliary care. And it is worth just reminding ourselves that the average length of stay in a care home is 24 months and in a nursing home is 12 months. And what that really means is that most people who enter those sorts of services will never in fact reach their care cap. So they will not actually benefit from very much of this, of these reforms. They might benefit something around the means testing. Also, because house prices vary across the country, again, the value of this reform varies enormously. What we have here is average house prices, so over 500,000 in London, 145,000 in the northeast. If you say £120,000 to reach your care cap, what that means is if you're in London, you're down 24% on the value of your asset, but if you're in the northeast, you're down 82% on the value of your asset. So it lands very differently depending on where you are in the country and the value of any assets that you own. The other thing that I think is particularly striking about all of this is the government doesn't actually know how many people are forced to sell their homes. It's not a number that anybody knows. In 2006, the government claimed it was 30 to 40,000 people, and they based that on research at that point that was already over 10 years old. And then the Daily Telegraph, working with someone called Philip Davis, an MP, claimed that it was more like 20,000 people. It's worth reminding ourselves there are 5.7 million people aged 75 and older in the UK. And it's probably true that about 10% of those people will end up spending something like £100,000 on care, but that will be spread for some of them over many, many years. If you're doing that over domiciliary care, that could be a very long period of time that you were spending that money. And those people probably will benefit from some of the kind of means testing element, but not so much of the kind of care cap. So, what does this mean going forward? If remember, it's a 3-year plan, so we know what's happening in the next 3 years. At the end of 3 years, the Chancellor is meant to sit down and decide whether or not the current division of the levy, so 82% to the NHS, 18% social care, will continue. In fact, it will have to change, or there will have to be additional money, because otherwise we won't be able to cover the costs of the social care reform, because obviously the numbers of older people who start to qualify will increase every single year as we go forward until they kind of reach a kind of outer limit, but that will be some way off. That's not going to have done in 3 years. Having said that, though, it's very, very hard to imagine a Chancellor reducing funding to the NHS, so we don't think that's terribly likely. But what we do think is probably more likely is that some of these noises that we're hearing about the form of integration, and one of the issues there is going to be perhaps the promotion of more shared budgets. What that will mean is that you can sort of cover up to a degree any kind of shifting around of money, because it all goes into one large pot. But we'll have to wait and see, because obviously we haven't in fact had that white paper. There are some other things in the government's plan about building back better for their plan for social care. It's worth reminding ourselves it's a 35-page long plan, so it's not a terribly detailed plan at this stage. Mostly about the NHS, mostly about money, but does some additional proposals, some of which are going to be in the white paper, some of which are already in the Health and Care Act, and Jane will talk about those a bit more later on. The main kind of ideas they've got is take steps to ensure that the 5.4 million unpaid carers have support, advice and respite they need, fulfilling the goals of the Care Act. It's not clear if that's going to be funded out of the 5.4 additional money for reforms, Invest more in disabled cities grants, excellent idea. Improve information services to help people navigate the care system, and introduce a new assurance framework. It's worth pointing out that we don't know what those steps are, and we don't know if there's any additional money. We don't know how much money has been involved there. We don't know where it would come from, and we don't know how this will be paid for or organised. There is a little bit more clarity about the assurance framework, and we're just going to come to that very briefly now, but Jane will cover it a bit more. Essentially, it's all about integration. The government, this is a direct quote, the government will work with citizens, the NHS, local governments and other key stakeholders to co-produce a comprehensive national plan for supporting and enabling integration between health and social care. Very clear statement of intent, obviously no great detail. The government are going to work to identify how this is actually going to operate, and including how it's going to fit in with ICSs. And also there's this new role for CQC in terms of oversight of local authority commissioning, but also in terms of the performance of ICSs, and Jane will cover that a bit more. I think the thing that we're seeing here is a shift away from social care being a purely local issue to one that is now being funded through a national programme of both individual and corporate taxation. And I think that does suggest some more centralisation of control. Indeed, one of the takeaways for the government about the pandemic was that, in fact, they didn't have a command and control ability when it came to social care. That was something that was much more spread out. They couldn't get hold of it in the same sort of easy way. They're very clear that they want to see greater integration. They're very clear they want to see greater oversight, and are giving most of that role to CQC. I think it's important to recognise that the legislation that's going through at the moment essentially is fixing the shape of the NHS. And what that means is that that's the structure which social care will have to integrate with. There isn't another structure on the table. So that's the structure that we'll have to integrate with, and that has certain implications. And one of those is about the scale of things. So I think overall, I think a lot of this stuff is broadly positive news for larger providers. I think it's probably less good news for small providers, although obviously greater oversight of what social services is doing is probably good news for everybody who commissions or has their services commissioned by local government. And I'm just going to pause there to see if there are any kind of issues that have come up in the chat that I need to respond to before I move on to national living wage. I'm speaking to Julian there.
Two comments. First is a question. Is there any calculation on how much it will cost social care staff and providers in terms of contributions from the levy?
The answer is no, but you could probably make a rough estimate of that. We know there's about 1.6 million staff. We know that our roughly kind of average sort of salary, so it's probably possible to make that calculation, but it's quite substantial. It's quite a substantial amount of money. Getting on for 2 million staff is a lot of people.
And the other is a comment that there's some well-informed conversations about investing some of the £500 million towards staff and a competency framework for social care staff. Mm-hmm. And I've heard similar things about setting up a registration scheme for social care staff, although that's been going on for years now, those discussions, and nothing's ever happened. Okay,
jolly good. That's fine. And we're going to move on now and talk about national living wage, only very briefly. I suppose the main story went up by 6% from April 2022, large percentage increase since April 2016, and in fact the largest cash increase ever. And there you can see all the different increases that have had over the years. And so 59p is the largest cash jump that we've seen in the national living wage. Obviously, as a percentage, that's not as big as it has been in the past. You'll notice back there in October 2001, it went up by 10.8%. But more recently, it's gone up by smaller amounts, although this is still a significant uplift from last year, which was only 2.2%. What it does do is it narrows that gap between national living wage, real living wage, and the London living wage. And as you can see, this is going back over the 5 years. The distance between those different things has got smaller and smaller, and particularly, it has to be said, between national living wage and UK living wage. And you can see that as well in terms of the percentage uplifts that have gone on. Obviously, it was very low for everybody in 2021, but now we can see the national living wage 6.6%, whereas UK living wage went up by 4.2%, and London living wage only went by 1.8%. So there is a real push at the moment around national living wage. If you think about that in comparison with the real living wage, That's narrowed most quickly. So in 2018, it was nearly £1 difference between those two rates. It's now down to 40p. And I think one of the things that we think is it's very unlikely that if these sort of levels continue to increase at this sort of rate, remember we're aiming for a target of 2/3 of median earnings, I think it's going to be very difficult for most care providers to outrun national living wage rates, which are going to kind of be chasing them down over the next few years. Of course, it's worth reminding ourselves that your employees will not actually experience the full 6.6% uplift due to the increase in national insurance. So obviously their take-home pay will not go up in line with that. And obviously for employers who are paying national living wage and will also have to pay the additional increase in their employer's national insurance contribution, we think of about 70% of their total spend is on wages, that the uplift they'll experience is around 5.5%. And that's a kind of non-negotiable 5.5%. That is a 5.5% increase that if they don't pay it, actually they'd be breaking the law, because they wouldn't be making the national insurance contributions, they wouldn't be paying people in line with the national living wage. So I think a huge challenge for the sector, and one where there doesn't seem to be very much of a proposed solution. I'm going to talk briefly about the state of care because we didn't want to slip past without us talking about it. And it's really just a very quick summary. It's quite a good document, I have to say. I think it's quite good in terms of the way in which it describes the impact of the pandemic on social care and the consequences for people who use those services and also people who work in them, for the organisations that employ them. There is a bit of a gap, which is that it doesn't really talk about the very high death rates in care homes. But it does talk about lots of other things in relation to how it's impacted on the sector. There is very little in this which talks about how these things are going to be made better. They talk a great deal about the 5.4 billion of additional funding around NHS, about social care reform, but actually most of that's already spoken for, as you already said, and therefore it's not very clear what they think is going to change to improve things. They've drawn on data from their market oversight, particularly in relation to describing the circumstances of older people services. So of course, these are larger operators. They're not the small operators, the larger operators, hard to replace operators of older people services. What they're saying really, from what they can see, is that occupancy has continued to fall from the start of 2020, and it's still falling in 2021. In other words, that's a pattern that has been maintained right the way across. So periods of when things have come out of lockdown haven't actually had much of an impact on that. Profitability is seen to have fallen to the lowest level, which is not really very surprising for these providers since the oversight process began. A change in the mix of who's actually going into care. So self-funders have fallen from 46% of the population to 41% of the population. And interestingly, care home providers with a low proportion of self-funders have seen occupancy fall less significantly than those with a higher proportion. In other words, people who could vote with their feet and leave have simply done that. What is interesting to say about all this, of course, the total number of beds in the system hasn't really changed very much across 2020 or 2021. So these are real vacancies. This isn't a shrinkage of the market. Actually, all those spaces are still available. It's just that nobody, in fact, is taking them up, and that's one of the reasons why profitability has been hit so very, very hard. They're also very worried about social care provider sustainability, raises lots of concerns about things that we all know about: low profit margins and losses, low pay, poor retention of staff, struggling with recruitment, growing levels of sickness amongst the workforce. They make an interesting comment about nursing homes having to deregister as nursing homes because they actually can't get nurses, because nurses are leaving social care, in some cases having to say going to join the health service. They talk a bit about the handing back of contracts and the closure of homes, but generally there isn't anything new. I think what we can see is that the accumulation of these things is significantly worse than it has been in previous years. And I suppose their anxiety about this is clearly very, very high, but there are no obvious solutions on the table about how that's going to be addressed. We always look at quality, and it has to say that quality improvements seem to have somewhat stalled in terms of social care. As you can see, as we go forward, 2020, 14.6% of homes were rated, or social care services were rated as requiring improvement. Nearly 80% were rated as being good. Very similar picture in 2021. And even if we look at it by domains, so those are the different domains: caring, responsive, effective and safe, safe and well-led. You can still see that well-led has the poorest outcome. And that has continued right the way through. There are differences in social care quality in terms of the types of services. So nursing homes generally have much poorer quality than community social care. It is worth reminding ourselves that those are the actual kind of numbers that sit behind some of that, and those are a bit different. So as we can see in the case of nursing homes, that's 838 nursing homes requiring improvement. That's 1,473 residential care homes. You can see there that community social care is a very, very small part of the overall package in terms of what they're regulating. What it does mean, though, is that around 5,500 people, vulnerable people, are living in a care home that's actually rated as inadequate on a daily basis, and 68,000 of them are living in homes which require improvement. And that's probably the lowest number. Certainly, if those people are living in nursing homes, the chance is it's a larger dwelling, and therefore actually those numbers would be higher than that. So the real key message is that really the quality improvements have stalled. Not altogether surprising. I think there are lots of reasons we can understand why they may have stalled. The real test is if they can start improving from this point forward.
This is really a fairly short piece because it's an update on the piece that we did in July when we looked at what was happening in terms of inspections. And there was concern at the time that the inspections that were taking place following pandemic, following this drop-off inspections, when inspections then taking place, it was resulting in worse outcomes. So we looked at those figures, and that was to some extent confirmed, although alongside an increase in the worse outcomes for inspections, also an increase in the homes which did better out of an inspection. So we've looked at an update of the number of inspections that have been conducted and looked at the change in quality. And the last briefing looked at the figures, or we compared data from September to November 2019 with data from April to June 2021. And this time we're looking at, in addition, July to September 2021. So this is what's happening in inspections generally. So this is all services, and as you can see, before the first lockdown, inspections are going at a fairly high, consistent rate. It was dropping off slightly, but I think that does annually anyway. And then the lockdown came along and the numbers dropped. Now, the first thing to note is that these figures are based on the date that the report is published, not when the inspection takes place. So there is a lag of a month to 6 weeks. So if you sort of move along that lockdown column by about a month, it makes more sense because there is about a month's delay in seeing the impact of reduced inspections on the report being published. So you can see that in April, inspections remain at a fairly high level and then drop off considerably in May, and that's as the reports from the inspections start to come out, and then it drops off, and then it starts to pick up again from August 2020, and it maintained a fairly steady but slow increase from then until August this year, and then there was another drop off in September. I don't know what caused that drop off. One possibility is that the pace of inspections has picked up more quickly over the last couple of months, and there's a lag in the publishing of the reports themselves. So it might be that there's just a lag in the figures rolling through as reports are published, because there's always been a lag in getting reports out. And if a lot of inspections are taking place, that lag gets longer. And then if you look at other client groups, older adults, the other thing to note here is that the first slide covers all services, whereas these next two slides just look at older adults, so no other client groups, and working age adults, no other client groups. So it's a subset, and it doesn't include services which are registered across multiple client groups. Just why, so these figures look a lot lower than that first one. So you can see older adults, much lower level, but it's the same pattern again. They drop off and then they've started to pick up, and the drop off in inspections for older adults started in August. And then for working age adults, again, same pattern again. it was a slower recovery following the lockdown, and it started to pick off. And again, that small drop again in September. So one of the concerns was that there was a view that inspections taking place for lockdowns were harsher than they were before. So more homes were getting worse inspection outcomes than they were before the inspections. So we looked at initially 2 3-month periods, one 3-month period from 2019, and then compared the inspections of those homes which then took place between October, November, to see what change had taken place. So the first thing is that there is some risk rating taking place. So the first inspections, certainly first inspections after lockdown, were very much risk-based. So you'd expect there to be more change in the ratings of results because the inspections are triggered by some concern about the service. And secondly, and actually the last paragraph, it covers all services, but where we look at individual client groups, it's services only registered for that particular client group. So for working age adults, we only look at services registered for that client group and not services which are registered for any other group as well. So I will cover this. So this covers all client groups. So you can see at the bottom there, there's 2019, where 59% of inspections resulted in no change. So they went in or came out with the same rating as they went in with. In 2021, the first part of the first 3 months, so April to July, the proportion whose inspection results made the same dropped quite substantially down to 41%. With a sort of equal split of increase in homes results getting a worse result and those getting a better result. And the last 3 months, the most recent 3 months, that percentage staying the same has increased slightly, but it is still a shift, particularly towards homes getting a worse result. So 30% of homes get a worse inspection result compared with 27% whose inspection result is better. Older adults, very similar pattern. There was more churn in the inspection results anyway back in 2019, but that has continued, although there is a more even split between homes who get better as a result or worse. And for working age services, much bigger drop. So back in 2019, 73% of inspections resulted in no change, and only 15% of inspections resulted in a drop in quality rating. Whereas in 2021, the first part is 40%. That's reduced down to 31%, but it's still quite a large increase in homes which end up with a worse inspection result, and only 24% are getting a better one. And then had a quick look at domiciliary care as well. So this covers all client groups, but you can see it's a very similar pattern there as well. Although actually the number of domiciliary care inspections is considerably lower than they were in all other services. So residential care services had much higher levels of inspections as inspections have picked up again. The vast majority of inspections have been in care homes and not in domiciliary care. I suspect some of that because of the complexity of doing inspections of domiciliary care services when you're trying to avoid COVID risks. And final couple of charts looks at the amount of change in the rating. So if you think of an inspection result which has the same, so you go in with a good service, you come out, the rating is the same. If you go in with a good and you come out with a requires improvement, that would be a drop of -1. And similarly, if you go in with a requires improvement and you come out with an outstanding, it would be a +2 result. So you can see there, in terms of the periods in 2019, most services went up or down by 1 where they did change. And in the later 2 3-month periods, there's been, not only has there been a greater move away from ratings staying the same, but there's also been an increase in the number of services which increased or decreased by 2 points. So you've got more homes which have improved quality by, for example, inadequate to good, or requires improvement to outstanding. And similarly, you've got some who drop much further. Older adults, similar picture again. And for working age adults, again, same picture. There was one service in 2019 which managed to drop by 3 points. So presumably went from outstanding to inadequate or similar. In conclusion, there's a continual polarization result of inspections of the last 6 months. So before COVID, 2/3 of inspections resulted in no change to the rating, and now 2/3 of inspections do. And although I think risk basis inspections following the pandemic have increased this trend, actually some of this is part of CQC's new inspection strategy. So they want to reduce the number of inspections taking place and base inspections much more on risk. So it's similar to Ofsted's approach in terms of schools, that they look at the services where they think there's been change. So that could be change for the worse. So they've had a flurry of complaints about a service, or it could be services where they think there's been improvement. So their own monitoring, or again, from comments from users, have indicated that the service has improved dramatically. And both of those things might trigger an inspection. So I think going forward, we will see a greater this sort of greater trend towards there being more change as a result of an inspection, for better or worse. But the other part of this is it becomes much harder to see the overall quality trends taking place, because the services who are staying the same aren't going to be getting inspected. So we're not going to know as much about those services. So what it means is it'll look like services are either getting dramatically better or dramatically worse as a result of inspections, whereas in fact, it could be they're saying the same. So it's going to be quite difficult to see what those longer term patterns that the state of care has picked up this time will report on in future, because obviously the inspection results are going to be skewed to some extent. But I think what you can say is you won't return to a level of inspections that took place in 2019 and before. So that's the end of that one. I will stop that share, and there are no questions on that. So I will move on to the next one, which I'll just find the slide for that. Right, I will share this one. Right, here we go. So next piece, more slides and more charts. Going to look at the deprivation of liberty safeguards, and then move on to look at the linked issue of safeguarding. So we haven't looked at this for a few years. The last time we looked at it, it was supposed to be the last year of DoLS, because the LPS scheme, which I was going to say what the name is, the Liberty Protection Scheme, was supposed to be taking over the following year, and reporting was going to be based on that scheme. But then implementation was delayed, so that is now supposed to be coming into force in April next year, April 2022. So it'll all be changed next year. So this is instead an update on what's happened with DoLS referrals since we last looked at it, and it's drawn from data from NHS Digital, and then we'll look at safeguarding, which is also comes from NHS Digital. So really, so I suppose the overall message is that there's not much change from the trends that we looked at last time. As you can see, 2014-15, there was a massive jump in the number of DoLS referrals, and that was a result of the West Cheshire judgment, which now seems like a very long time ago, but that heralded the massive increase in DoLS applications, and that continued to increase year on year up until last year, when the numbers tailed off a bit. I suspect this is pandemic related, although we're not absolutely sure why. One possibility is that although it resulted in a greater number of people losing their liberty in terms of being restrained at home, the councils might have viewed that as more of an issue regarding the whole home rather than individuals, and may not have encouraged DoLS applications in relation to people in that circumstance. And the other possibility, which I think we see in safeguarding, is that local authorities' capacity to undertake work on this much reduced in the pandemic and the lockdowns, and therefore they were discouraging applications in the first place. Applications by region, as you can see, this pattern of increase year on year was reflected across most of the regions, with some variance. The Southwest, East of England, and London have shown some variance in how that happens. And the Northeast has remained consistently high. They've had a high level right from the start, really, and that was driven by quite a lot of joint work that took place across Northeast authorities to train providers on DoLS and safeguarding and streamline application processes. And that has, well, you could say, paid off in terms of the increased number of applications, though it has presumably increased the administrative burden on those authorities. In terms of applications, there's still a considerable variation in the rate of DoLS referrals. So Stockton-in-Tees, they have the highest rate, and this is looking at the rate of applications per 100,000 of the population. So they have a rate of nearly 2,000 applications per 100,000 of the population. At the other end of the scale, we've got Lancashire, who have just 37 applications. I'm not quite sure how they manage that. And they're just behind the Isles of Scilly, which their one resident has there's 72, turns into 72 applications per 100,000. Then you've got Dudley at 153, Ealing at 204, and the average for the group as a whole, so 151 authorities, is Solihull, which is at 650 applications. And most of the councils in that top 10 with the highest rate at the Northeast, so there are 8 out of the top 10. And here's a chart showing these figures. So you can see there that sort of that reduction down from Stockton at the top with their 2,000, and Lancashire at the bottom, and Solihull there in the middle with the average. And I'll say that top 10, in those top 10 bars, 8 of those are in the Northeast, and the other 2 are in the Northwest. Right, move on to safeguarding. And this is another one we haven't looked at for a few years, and it was mainly because nothing much was changing year on year. And actually, what we've discovered by looking at it again after a few years break is actually nothing is continuing to happen much in terms of change. So we've seen the same patterns repeating, but it is quite useful to check back in again. So one of the reasons to look at it is to see whether there was any impact from COVID and the various lockdowns on DoLS and safeguarding, but also because we undertook a benchmarking exercise with a group of providers, a number of which are on this in this briefing now, to look at safeguarding medication incidents to see what kind of patterns are taking place. So one of the interesting comparisons is what similarities there is between a national picture and what's happening with those providers. So one of the changes that has taken place since we looked at it last is that NHS Digital now split up what they report on. So they report on safeguarding concerns and Section 42 inquiries. So a concern is any suspected abuse or neglect reported to or identified by a local authority. And the Section 42 inquiry is a concern that meets the criteria for investigation under Section 42 of the Care Act 2014. And then there's another group of inquiries that take place, which is where a concern is raised and is investigated, but doesn't meet that Section 42 criteria. And NHS Digital only provide the detailed analysis of the Section 42 inquiries. So we don't know about the background to the concerns raised, or about these inquiries that don't meet the Section 42 criteria. And so in terms of numbers, overall, there were 500,000 safeguarding concerns raised in 2020-21. The total inquiries made, so that's Section 42 and other inquiries, is 168. Yeah, about a third. And then of the Section 42, most of those are most of the inquiries are Section 42 inquiries, with a small number, 16 or 17,000 of other inquiries. So one of the helpful things that NHS should do is that although they've changed how they report it since we last looked at it, they have backdated their reporting to pull out the distinction between concerns and inquiries. And this is this impact year on year over the period. So you can see that in terms of concerns, those have risen every year fairly consistently. And on the face of it, it looks like the number of Section 42 inquiries has increased as well. But actually, in percentage terms, there has been a bit more variation. So it has been increasing, but actually, it hasn't kept pace with the increase of concerns. So in 2015, 43% of concerns resulted in a Section 42 inquiry, compared to just 31% last year. And by region, so the greatest number of concerns, and this is the number rather than percentages or the rate, largest number took place in the southeast, and 31% of theirs resulted in an inquiry. And at the other end of the scale, you've got the southwest. Well, actually, no, you've got the east of England with just 21. Oh, no, it's the Yorkshire and Humberside, but 21% of their concerns result in inquiry. Where it gets more interesting, if we look at the rate of Section 42 inquiries by 100% of the population, 100,000 of the population. So you can see there that, again, you've got the northeast at the top there, and that links back to that training they did on DoLS and safeguarding way back in 2015. So they had the highest rate for their adult population. So this is the population aged 18 plus, and you can see there the average for England. So you've got West Midlands, where you've got a group of East Midlands, London, South East, South West, and West Midlands below the average. Mainly because of North East being so high. Type of risk, probably not a surprise. The largest percentage of risk comes from accident, neglect, and omission, followed by physical abuse and psychological abuse. And from the benchmarking exercises we did with providers, overall, it's the same pattern, that accident, neglect are the highest level, followed by physical abuse and psychological abuse. Although one interesting thing we did discover is that, and we can't do this analysis with the NHS digital figure, is if you look at the perpetrator, then if the perpetrator is a member of your staff, then by far the highest risk comes from is of neglect and acts of omission, which is probably what you'd expect. And if you look at risk from other service users, the type of risk is physical abuse. And again, that's by far the highest percentage on that. Location of risk, which may be a surprise, it's people's own homes by quite a large margin as well. 50% of inquiries come from a risk which is from people's own homes. So some of that would be domiciliary care, but it might be people who are being cared for by relatives. And again, we can't break down this by the type of risk, so we don't know what the type of risk is that people have in their own homes, sadly. And care homes, next highest at 22%, followed by nursing homes. So between nursing homes and care homes, that's 30%, but own homes is the highest level. Support type, so client group, The highest group is physical support, and this is basically older people, and particularly older people without mental health support needs. And learning disabilities is 11%, largely as a result of the sort of relatively low percentage of people with learning disabilities compared to older people. And this really comes out in terms of age group. So this is the rate per 100,000 population for these age groups. So you can see the rate for 18 to 64-year-olds is comparatively low compared to the rate for 85 plus. That's where the risk of safeguarding risks are. It's 85 plus people, presumably living at home. And finally, a quick look at the outcomes. And again, we don't have any other analysis on this. So this is what the outcome is, and actually that is fairly consistent across the groups. The lowest is the southeast at just under 70%, compared to the southwest, which is just under 80%. So the data on DoLS, as I said, confirms the large differences between the local authorities, and the northeast is particularly well. And the patterns are very similar, although both show a drop-off in the last year. And the biggest risks of safeguarding is to people over 80 and those living in their own homes. And there are no comments, so I will hand on to Jane.
So I am going to give a bit of an update on the Health and Care Bill, which is the bill that passes into law the arrangements around the new integrated care systems. So I'm going to give an update on how that's going and some of the issues around that. Just a quick reminder of what's in the bill. And this is mostly a slide that I showed in April, but there are a few changes here, which I'll talk about in a moment. So we had a white paper back in February, and then the bill was introduced in July. So it started its passage in July. So what we're familiar with is that there are 42 integrated care systems, which will now control most NHS resources. And each area is going to have two elements. So they'll have the NHS integrated care system, which is called an integrated care board. They're the ones with the statutory powers. And then sitting next to those are integrated care partnerships. So they're the ones that are going to involve local authorities and any other partners who obviously won't have powers to decide on NHS budgets and spend NHS money and so on, but they will be part of the conversation about providing health and care in the local area. CCGs are going to be abolished with the integrated care boards taking on their functions. So effectively, they will be, the people delivering those will be tupied over and rolled up into the ICS employment structure. There's going to be a new duty on NHS organisations and local authorities to collaborate with one another. And ICBs are going to delegate budgets to local place-based partnerships. Now, all of this is really catching up with things that have been happening for a while already. And so what we're seeing in lots of places is quite well established now provider alliances and partnerships who are starting to spend money and sub-commission services on behalf of integrated care systems. And also much has been made of the removal of the requirement for competitive tendering that was in the original, the 2012 Act that enshrined the Lansley reforms, which might not be quite such good news as some people might think, but then there's a whole discussion around that. But for the moment, I'm going to concentrate on a few things which are in the bill, which might be of particular interest now. One of the other main elements is reducing bureaucracy and increasing public confidence and accountability, which Matt Hancock thought meant more new powers for the Secretary of State. So Secretary of State being able to direct NHS England, intervene at any time in service reconfigurations, mess about with arm's length bodies, abolish them if he wants, transfer functions to and from them. So yeah, so this was his grand plan. Obviously, Matt is no more, and we now have the SAG, who still thinks these things are a good idea. So these are still in the bill, and also we have in the bill proposals for the NHS to review integrated care systems and local authority social care functions, and I'm going to say a bit more about that in a minute. And actually, just news that came out yesterday was leaked out via the Health Service Journal is that Health Education England is going to be merged into NHS England as well. So actually, it looks like there's a bit of a drive to reduce the number of arm's length bodies and put everything into NHS England under the watchful eye of the Secretary of State. The bill is progressing at the moment through Parliament. So the green boxes are the stages that it's been through in the House of Commons. So it's just about to finish its report stage on the 22nd of this month, when it will then get its third reading in the House of Commons. So the Commons then get a chance to vote on it again. And then after that, it goes to the House of Lords, and those are the red circles there. It has to go through all the same stages in the House of Lords. I suspect the time scale is not, as I've put here, it will be much more compressed, unless there is a lot of discussion in the House of Lords and a lot of requests for amendments, which, as I'll talk about in a minute, there is quite a strong possibility of. So then the bill needs to get royal assent. That's the crown down there, and then it can be implemented. So this timetable is very tight, and people are now starting to worry a little bit about whether there's going to be enough time to make all the practical arrangements that need to be made before ICSs can go live as statutory bodies. So it's kind of a bit squeaky bum time for the bill. Will it be through in time? Contents, there are 6 parts to it. So the first part deals with integration. The second part, there's a whole section on information, which I suspect is sort of very much the baby of Matt Hancock, who was very keen on data and information. The third is all about the Secretary of State's powers. The fourth is about the Health Service Safety Investigations Body. And then parts 5 and 6 contain a range of measures, which are, for example, calorie labelling on foodstuffs and restrictions on advertising of junk food. The bill doesn't actually define what an integrated care system is. It just assumes that everybody knows what that is. So integrated care boards, they're going to be responsible for commissioning health services, but they'll also have legal duties, including reducing health inequalities, maintaining patient choice, and promoting integration. So alongside commissioning services, they're also having to do those things. And there is some recognition that when sustainability and transformation partnerships plans were originally put out there was very little public involvement in that, and that caused a lot of hoo-ha. So there is a requirement in the bill for integrated care boards to ensure public involvement in commissioning decisions, although it doesn't specify exactly how they must do that. But they do have to publish forward plans, and they have to consult on those. And they do have to prepare an annual report setting out how they've done their work in the previous financial year. And NHS England must performance assess each ICB. So there are already a set of performance measures for ICSs there, which they are being assessed against, which doesn't result in an overall rating, but there's a range of domains. And they're not allowed to spend more money than they have, and there are other financial requirements that NHS England can impose. And then if NHS England decides that the Integrated Care Board isn't doing what it should be doing, it can intervene and get rid of the Chief Executive. So it's not up to the chair of the board to do that. NHS England can do that. And then the integrated care partnerships that sit alongside that. Each integrated care board and local authority has to establish one of those. And then together they have to create an integrated care strategy. And again, that needs to involve local people. And Then they have to prepare a joint local health and wellbeing strategy, which is going to set out, how they meet the population health and care needs of the local area. It's not clear, or it's not specified, who needs to be on those partnerships, except that it needs to be at least one person appointed by the Integrated Care Board, one person appointed by each of the local authorities that fall within that area, and then anybody else. So it could be, could be representatives from providers on there. There are provider representatives on some of the ICSs at the moment, and they could well sit on there. I think one of the most interesting areas in the bill is about the assurance and inspection of adult social care. So in terms of an assurance framework, there was a report that came out in March from the National Audit Office, which pointed out that there isn't very much oversight of local authority delivery of adult social care in England. So we used to have that. If you remember, most of us probably old enough to remember that local authorities used to be inspected and rated on their social care functions. But that was one of the first things that the coalition government got rid of in 2010. And that was replaced by a sort of system of continuous improvement and peer support and sector-led improvement. But the National Audit Office pointed out that the absence of something external has impacted on the quality and effectiveness of services. So there's going to be a new duty for CQC to review and assess local authorities' delivery of their adult social care duties. There aren't details about this in the bill, so that's all going to be set out in secondary legislation. And what the government is saying is that they will consult in the sector and with local authorities about what that looks like. But it may be that we go back to some sort of rating where we're looking at something from requires improvement to outstanding. So some sort of Ofsted style ratings. Really sorry, my dog is barking. So alongside this, ADAS is leading work on updating the adult social care outcomes framework. So ADAS is still involved on behalf of the sector, and that will form a sort of cornerstone of the new assurance framework. The bill also provides for the Care Quality Commission. I don't think my dog approves of inspection. I think she's a bit laissez-faire, that's what it is. So for CQC to, and this is the actual wording in the bill, to conduct reviews of what's going on in each ICB and how they're exercising their functions, and also to assess the functioning of the system, the whole integrated system, how it works, and to publish a report. And again, there's nothing about how a rating system might work, but there is quite a strong push from some quarters for this to result in not only in a report, which sort of describes what's been found, but also ratings for integrated care systems, as well as ratings for local authorities. So CQC is going to be quite busy. It's going to have to recruit quite a lot more people to do this sort of work, probably. I mentioned that there's a whole section in the bill about data and information. And in particular, there is quite a lot about data on adult social care. So the bill gives the Secretary of State the power to require all CQC registered providers to provide information about the people they're providing care to and what activities they're undertaking. So at the moment, local authorities provide aggregated data, which they get largely only from the providers that they commission, although they can get it from others as well. But it's incomplete. And the idea is that all providers should provide that information, and that it should be at a client level, and it will flow through to NHS Digital from local authorities' case management systems. And in the case of private providers, if they don't provide that information, then the Secretary of State can fine them for not doing so. So it's quite interesting. I mean, it could be a really useful data set. It could eventually replace the SALT data if it's working effectively. And it could be linked up with health data, so it could enable all sorts of triangulation. It could be used for research purposes, for commissioning and planning purposes. It could be really useful. And then alongside that, there's an aspiration that social care providers, this is in the Brave New World, Exciting Future, social care providers should have online access to information about the people that they care for. And those people should have care records, and anyone anywhere in a social care setting should be able to go in and see information about previous care they've received or other care they're getting, and also about the health interventions that they're getting. So that's possibly, in terms of creating the infrastructure for that to happen and the costs involved, that's probably quite some way away, but that's an aspiration there. In terms of the progress with actually setting up ICSs, they have been galloping ahead, and because they have to have these people in place when they go live. So they've been recruiting chief executives designates. They've all got chairs for their ICBs, except 4 of them. 26 of them now have recruited chief executives designate. 6 areas have tried and failed to recruit people. So there's a bit of a pattern there. It's mainly in the Midlands that's happened. So for some reason around the Midlands, people don't want to be chief executives of the ICS. And just looking at the current or most recent jobs of the people who've been appointed, the most common background is that they are already a CCG chief executive. So you can completely understand how the CCG chief executives would transition to that role. But there are people in other roles as well. So there are some acute trust CEOs, 2 mental health trust CEOs, 2 council chief execs, 1 community health trust CEO. There's somebody who is currently the chief executive of a national charity, and a couple of others, but predominantly people from a CCG background so far. Just some issues about all of this. As I said, there's a lot of uncertainty about the timetable for passing the bill and whether there's going to be enough time for ICSs to go live by the 1st of April when they're supposed to. So it may be that the going live date has to be set back by 3 months or 6 months. Because they need time to set up their systems, and they can't do that until the bill is pretty much passed. Otherwise they risk wasting a lot of money and time. But its passage isn't really expected to be completely straightforward in the House of Lords. There are a number of people in the House of Lords who know a lot about health and who might well want to put their own 2 pennyworth in. And it may be that the government has to give ground on some of this to keep the bill on track. So the sorts of things that the Lords are likely to take up, workforce is a key one. So they won't be setting a requirement for Health Education England to publish projections and a plan, because Health Education England will be part of NHS England. But actually that could be good news, because it could mean that NHS England has to take more ownership of workforce and a plan. And actually where the workforce plan is will also be where the money is. But publishing that workforce plan and those projections will expose gaps and it will show that more money is needed, very likely. It's likely that the Lords might not be that keen on the new powers for the Secretary of State. Some of them certainly won't, and they might challenge that. Also, sort of perhaps not quite such a big issue, but there will be some who won't like calorie labelling and banning junk food ads. Could be some are sponsored by some of those companies, who knows. And there is probably, it's quite likely also that they will want to leave foundation trusts alone and not let NHS England direct their capital spending. They might also want the bill to go further on how ICS is going to be accountable to the public, because at the moment there are aspirations in there, but nothing that concrete. So in terms of next steps, the bill needs to pass for ICSs to become operational. And then we've also got the intention to publish a white paper on integrating the health and social care system. So probably given the progress of the bill so far, that will come out before the bill passes. And really what that's likely to do is, as Tom said earlier, is to sort of put social care into the structure that has been set up for the NHS. So some sort of integration, some sort of national health and care system or something like that. And then in the longer term, what's happening is that provider collaboratives are evolving all the time, and some of them have now become quite effective and quite powerful. So, you know, there is talk about will eventually provider collaboratives just take over from ICSs and become the accountable care organisations that the proposals envisaged some time ago, but that didn't find its way into the bill.